So it is Wednesday, March 3rd, and we're in the second part of our series taken from the Sanctuary for Lent devotional for 2021, following along with the themes for each week. Last week, we explored the theological theme of covenant and also the theme of covenant in two families with adopted children, Jalen Joyce and Jameson Steinhelfer, both fostered and then adopted by their families. And we spoke both theologically and practically about what it means to covenant with one another. And connected with the theme of covenant is that of God's presence. God makes us promises of presence and love in covenant. And then we receive God's grace and God's care through God's abiding presence. And the promise of God is such an amazing grace that the creator of the universe would covenant with us. But I think equally amazing, astounding, is that the creator of the universe would be present with us. And I know for me, it's just such a deep mystery of faith that God is eternally, abundantly present, even when I forget about it, even when I'm convinced it's not true, even when God is not present in the way I would somehow like God to be. God is still faithfully present. So we're going to explore the theme of presence this evening with our own Peggy Haymes and focus in on what it means to be present to one another in times of grief. Because living through this particular pandemic time means that we are all acquainted with grief. We have all lost, over the past year, normal ways of being and doing and relating to others and the routines of life. We've lost a sense of normalcy. And on top of the pandemic stress that we've all experienced, we've experienced the normal flow of life that we would have if the pandemic had been in our midst or not, which always includes change. And with change comes loss, and always includes grief. So one way or another, we are all acquainted with what it means to lose and have to adjust. And the yearning to know that God is present to us in our grief. And I think also the yearning to know that others are present to us in our grief, and that we somehow might be equipped by faith to be present to those we care about in their grief as well. So Peggy has graciously offered to spend this time talking with us about that. Before I introduce her, now that I've set the stage for our topic, let's have a brief time of prayer to begin this program, and then I'll introduce Peggy, and then we'll get to the meat of our conversation and discussion. Let us pray. Loving God and astoundingly, amazingly present God, it's almost too good to be true that you are always with us. Give us eyes to see and ears to hear, that whether in a loud boom or a soft breeze or a still small voice, you walk beside us and you reside within us, not because we've earned your presence, not because we are shiny enough to attract your attention, not because we are good enough to merit your love, but simply because of who you are. You are expansive and generous, and your spirit floods all of your creation. And by grace, that includes each one of us. So, God, this evening, fill us with knowledge, sure knowledge of this. Bless our questions and our answers, our ponderings and our discussion. Help us to peel back some layers of wisdom and understanding on what it means for you to be present to us and how we might be present to one another. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen. I get the fun of introducing Peggy. Y'all know Peggy, of course. You're neighbors with Peggy. Longtime church fellow faith community members with Peggy. But one of the things I love about these Zoom meetings is that we get to know each other fresh and anew. And every time somebody sends me a bio blurb, I learn a little bit more about them. So Peggy Haymes is a minister, a coach, and a therapist, transitioning from professional chaplain to, well, she's been a professional therapist, but she's transitioning more into focusing her energy on therapy and grief counseling. She is a prolific writer. She's the author of 7 books and innumerable calls to worship. You may have heard that she has a dog named Bear and a cat named Boots, who we just saw a few minutes ago. She tends to mention them every once in a while. Her greatest claim to fame and greatest blessing is that Iris Womble was her 6th grade teacher. Please do not blame her, Iris Womble, for any of Peggy's grammatical errors. She tried. For over 20 years, Peggy has served on staff for grief workshops in California, Maine, and North Carolina. She was trained by and then worked with the workshop staff of grief pioneer Elizabeth Kubler-Ross. I believe her seminal work on death and dying.
On death and dying, yes.
Yeah. A giant in the field for sure. So Peggy comes to us with a vocational lifetime full of reflection and conversation and wisdom. So Peggy, we welcome you. And we're going to talk a little bit about grief and about how to be present to one another in grief. I'll ask a few questions and Peggy will respond. And then at the end of our conversation, all of us will have an opportunity to respond as we feel moved or ask questions. Also, I will say, if you have questions that you don't want to forget about, feel free to put them in the chat as we go along, and we'll make sure we get to them at the end of the conversation. So the first question is just simply, why is it important and valuable to be present with one another in times of grief?
I found this wonderful quote from David Kessler, who is another very well-known leader in the field of grief. And he said, each person's grief is as unique as their fingerprint. But what everyone has in common is that no matter how they grieve, they share a need for their grief to be witnessed. That doesn't mean needing someone to try to lessen it or reframe it for them. The need is for someone to be fully present to the magnitude of their loss without trying to point out the silver lining. And I think that says it in a nutshell, that part of the human community is that we need to bear witness and to be witnessed. In these grief workshops that I've staffed for all of these years, over and over and over again, what the participants tell us, one of the most important parts of the workshop is they just get to share their story and to talk about their grief. and in a space where there is no judgment of them, and in a space where grief is honored. Part of what being present for people in times of grief is it honors their grief and acknowledges that it's important. You know, we sometimes we think like there's this national ranking of grief, you know, like the top 20. And if your grief is up here, it matters. And if it's down here, well, you know, buck up, it's not that important. And I think, especially in this time of COVID, that we are losing so many people and their deaths are so awful that there can be a feeling it's like, well, my loved one just died of, you know, heart failure or cancer, or, you know, it's expected. It wasn't like it was COVID. Or if you have other kinds of losses, like Catherine was talking about, the losses we've experienced with, you know, I had somebody tell me, well, you know, it's my kid's graduation. And so the big scheme of things, it's not that big of a loss. Well, yeah, it is. If you've been waiting 18 years for something, it is a real loss. Um, my former cat Buster, as some of you know, went missing last fall and never showed up again. That was a real loss. And so, you know, part of what I experienced, and Knollwood is wonderful. In my experience, Knollwood has been wonderful in being supportive in the loss of a pet, which for some of us, it's a loss of a family member. But what I experienced were the folks who were willing to be present with me. And sometimes what gets in the way of that being present is we feel like we have to have the right words to say. Mm. And we for sure don't want to say the wrong words. And sometimes we get confused because we'll say something and somebody starts crying and we feel like we've done something wrong. You know, American white culture has this, or white Anglo-Saxon culture has this really twisted understanding. You know, someone will say, well, you went to that funeral. How's so-and-so? How's the family doing? Oh, they did so good. They didn't cry at all. Mm-hmm. You know, really? Mm-hmm. It's okay when we're sad. Sometimes we cry. I've had people say, well, you know, I didn't want to mention, like, this is with the death of a child. I didn't want to mention their kid because I was afraid they'd start crying and then I'd feel badly. Well, I guarantee you that parent was already feeling what they were feeling. And sometimes it is a great gift to have someone who can stand to be with us in our tears and in the rawness of that grief and not have to make it all better.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. That can be so hard, though, and it kind of brings me to the next question: is how can we become that non-anxious presence for other people in grief? Because we know someone else's grief, maybe we start feeling our own grief, and it just kind of all gets mixed up, and we want them to feel better and we want to be present. But so I guess what would be some just ways, what are some ways that we might practice, step out in faith in terms of being present to other people in their grief?
I think one of the things is to know that it's okay when you don't know what to say, I don't know what to say, but I'm really sorry. I am so, so sorry. And sometimes, you know, we get get really touched too. And it's okay to say, no, I've got some raw places in my own heart too. And it's just kind of touching those. And we can say that we can acknowledge what's going on in us without having to make the conversation about us. Because that's what happens sometimes when we want to say, oh, well, when my dad died, this is what I did. And what happens is then that immediately shifts the attention onto you. So if you're moved, if you find your own grief surfacing, it's okay to, I'm just, gosh, it's kind of surprising me, but I'm feeling some grief too. And if you can be present with them, be present. And sometimes we just can't. Sometimes our own grief is so big that we can say, I care about you. I love you. And I just can't be with you right now. So one of the things that enables us to be present with each other is by doing our own work. And I know I'm a therapist, I'm supposed to say this stuff, but it really is true. When I started staffing these workshops, I had been invited by Sharon Tobin, who had been in charge of Elizabeth's training program for staff. And she talked to me about staffing. I had trained with her. And she said, there's one rule for staff, and that is you have to keep doing your own work, because you can't be present with people unless you do. So sometimes that looks like paying attention to your own feelings that are coming up, your own grief, and even your own unresolved grief. Sometimes that looks like spiritual formation. But continuing to pay attention to what's going on inside of us, it clears a space so that then we can be present with other people. Stephen Levine has done wonderful writing about an area of grief and dying. He has a book called Who Dies? It's very moving. But one of the people he interviewed in the book was a cancer patient. And he said he got two kinds of visitors in the hospital. Back in the olden days when we could have visitors in the hospital, there were two kinds of visitors. One could not stay still. They always had to be doing something. Let me fluff up your pillow. Let me adjust the blinds. It's the sun in your eyes. Let me water this plant. Let me take care of this. They couldn't just be still. So the visitors he really liked were the people who just came in and sat. Sometimes they talked. Sometimes they just sat. And that was okay. We feel like we've got to be doing something to help make it better. And the reality is we can't fix it for them, because grief isn't something we fix. It's something we live through. And that kind of doing it takes the focus off of the patient or the person who's grieving. They're allowed to say what they want. So sometimes it really helps to be able to say, tell me the story. When I was a chaplain at Clemens, Catherine had originally asked me about, being a chaplain and being there at the point of death. And I was like, well, we don't have that much of that at Clemens. My colleagues at Forsyth probably were ministering on more deaths in a day than I saw in 3.5 years, just because of the nature of the kind of hospital it is. But sometimes I'd get a message from one of the team members that, so-and-so had come in for like hip replacement surgery. And it was the first time they were in the hospital since their spouse had died. And so I would go in and ask ask them to tell me about them. One of my favorite questions is, how did you meet?
Mm-hmm.
They get really great stories. One man met, they were in grade school together, like early grade school, and he tripped this little girl as she was getting off the bus. He's like, I don't know why I did that, but somehow she overcame that. Um, so it's the stories. The stories are part of the way that we heal. So to create a space for the telling of the stories, and that's one of the things that's been really hard with COVID. Um, some of y'all know one of my dear friends died in January, and he'd been the associate chaplain at Furman when I was there, and had really mentored me in many ways. And just like continually opened doors for me. We became great friends. And the word went out that he was dying of COVID.
Mm-hmm.
And, I'll just be on Facebook. My Furman buddies were popping up with stories about Jim. And, I thought about that part. The sadness was that if it wasn't for COVID, we would all be gathering together at Furman and sharing those stories with each other. Now we're going to do that in the fall, sometime out there, the big long list of memorial services, sometime out there, we will do that. But in that immediacy of the loss, there wasn't that chance to sit down together, say, you remember that time? You remember the way he used to do that? Mm-hmm. Which I think makes it even more important that we seek out those opportunities. Catherine and I were talking before we got started about how, doing stuff over Zoom has just kind of become second nature to a lot of us. And I Zoomed on Christmas Day with a couple of family members. And it was wonderful just to talk together. And so to reach out to people who are grieving, I said, just want to check in with you. Mm-hmm. How you doing? Tell me. Mm-hmm. What do you miss? What was their tradition? What did they really like? Mm-hmm. And just open up the space for that story. And it's funny that people know, they have like a sixth sense. They know that when you're okay in yourself and you're not all anxious about, am I doing this right? Am I going to say the wrong thing? They can sense that. And they know when it is more comfortable. There's another great quote. I don't know. I think some of you may know Rachel Remen. This is her second book. It's My Grandfather's Blessings. First one was Kitchen Table Wisdom. But she has this wonderful paragraph. Perhaps the most important thing we bring to another person is the silence in us. Not the sort of silence that is filled with unspoken criticism or hard withdrawal. The sort of silence that is a place of refuge, of rest, of acceptance of someone as they are. We are all hungry for this other silence. It is hard to find. In its presence, we can remember something beyond the moment, a strength on which to build a life. Silence is a place of great power and healing. Silence is God's lap.
What's the last word?
Lap, L-A-P.
Oh, wow.
Love that image of God's lap. And when you're bringing that kind of focus in, then all of a sudden it's okay. And you can ask, hey, What do you need? Do you want to talk? You want to just sit? You want me to go? It's okay, because it's not about us.
Mhm. Mhm. Peggy, what would you say to someone who feels ashamed of their grief? Like, particularly if they feel like, well, other people have greater losses than I do, or, my loss happened weeks, months, years ago, but I'm still grieving and I just feel ashamed. And so it's hard to ask anyone to bear witness to something that we're ashamed of. What would you say to that?
First of all, there's no such thing as closure. Um, I heard an interview with Anderson Cooper on NPR and talking about the death of his brother, and he said, closure is a word used by people who have never suffered great loss.
Mm.
Mm.
So grief comes in waves, and decades later, a wave can come up. I was sitting and talking with my mom probably a month before her own death, and she was in her early 80s. And she's kind of reflecting, and out of the blue, she said, I miss my daddy.
Hmm.
And her father had been gone for about 60 years.
Mm.
So it comes at different points in our life. It comes up. Anything that we are heart connected with is going to bring grief when we lose it. Whether it is a dream or a pet or a friendship, we really do not give enough attention to losing friends, whether it's by death or with a friendship breaks up. That can be a really tough loss. And I would, and I do say to people that there is no national ranking. Each person's loss matters, because it's your own heart. And if people are secretly, and sometimes not so secretly, afraid they're going to flunk grief, I'm not doing it right.
Mhm.
And Elizabeth talked about these different stages of grief: denial, anger, acceptance, depression, bargaining. And unfortunately, we took that and made it into stair steps that you check off and go do this one and check it off and check it off and check it off. And it made Elizabeth so mad at the end of her life. She was not a happy woman about that, because it was not what she intended. In fact, she said, they are tools, they're part of a framework. They're tools to help us frame and identify what we may be feeling, but they are not stops on some linear timeline of grief. So I think to reassure, grief is holy and grief is sacred. And sometimes it happens that when we experience the loss, we don't have the luxury of grieving. If your parent died when you were young and you were an older sibling and you had to step up and start taking care of things, or if your spouse died and you had kids and you had to find a way to survive, sometimes folks don't get to grieve that until decades later, because they didn't have the time and the opportunity. Sometimes we don't have the support. Sometimes we don't have people who can help us grieve. So grief is not a place for shaming. And I would say just honor your heart and honor what your heart needs. And there's no timeline, there's no expiration date, there's no national ranking. There's no judgment about which grief matters more.
Sounds like God sees our grief and knows that it just belongs and loves it and loves us for who we are in the midst of it.
Someone said, I don't remember where I saw this recently. Grief is the price we pay for having loved.
Well, how is our presence with one another in grief connected with God's presence to us? I wonder if you'd just draw some through lines between how we are present with one another and how our faith tells us that God is present with us.
The first thing I'll say to that is, again, being present with someone in their grief is really sacred work and really holy ground. And these workshops I do, some of them used to be 5 days long. The ones we do now are like 4 days, I think. And but how can you do that? Because people are just getting into the really hard stuff, and it's really hard. But it is such sacred ground. And I've talked with my colleagues, the fellow staff members, and the places that we do these workshops feel sacred to us now, because there's something so holy about it. And I think also it gives us an opportunity to experience in some small measure the gift that God gives to all of us, and that God bears witness to whatever we are going through and whatever we are feeling or struggling with, whatever we are carrying. God creates sanctuary for that and creates space for that. And when we are able to do that as God's children, it's like embodying a little bit of that grace with each other.
Well, it makes me think of the verse, we love because God first loved us. And going on what you just said, it's like we create sanctuary for others because God creates sanctuary for us. We experience that grace and that belonging, and it helps us have the courage to create it for others. Thank you, Peggy, for all of those reflections. Well, I wonder what questions or comments or memories or stories any of the rest of us might like to share with Peggy or with each other.
Peggy, it occurred to me that as you were talking, I thought back on, and this is old stuff, but Erickson's Ages and Stages. And the last stage is, and I don't remember his language, but it's like between cynicism and hope or something like that, the last stage of life. And instead of making those an either or, it seems to me in my own post-retirement, there's a lot of grief work I've had to do. In some ways had to do before I can celebrate some things. Just thinking back over my life.
Yeah, and that grief, like I said, the grief doesn't go away because we have not tended to it. And sometimes we tend to it, but it circles back around in a different form and different shape. And it calls for our attention. Sometimes, and in my experience has been, sometimes subtle little knocks And then if I don't pay attention to that, it gets louder and more demanding, and knocks my lamp down.
Wow.
Grief hits you all kinds of ways.
It does. It comes at all. Sometimes the light gets dim.
But there's a sense in which grief is a gift from God, that it's part of the way He's created us, and therefore to avoid it is in some way a lack of faith, a lack of trust that He will take me while I'm in that dark place, that He'll walk with me in that dark place. We had a member of our church years ago who said her pastor, who really was a respected pastor of a big First Baptist church, when her husband died, said to her, Grace, interesting her name, this is a time for you to show your faith and your trust in Jesus and how strong you are in your faith by not crying or not grieving.
Because people are going to be watching.
Yeah, people are going to be watching you.
And
she was telling us this probably 20 years later. And you better believe it was still.
But I'm not sure she was totally against him.
Oh, she loved him. He was a giant to her. And even after she said that, I think my reaction was, God, that was a terrible thing he said to you. She said, no, he was a great, he was a great pastor. But anyway,
He thought it was a little strange.
Well, yeah, I think we say things like that sometimes when we ourselves are uncomfortable with grief. It's like, this might open a door. And who knows what will happen if we allow ourselves to go through that door. Alfred Lord Tennyson wrote this humongously long poem in memoriam for his friend Arthur Hallam. I see if I memorized a short portion of that, and it's been a long time since I thought about it. But he was talking about this friend. I said, he faced his doubts, he gathered strength, he would not make his judgments blind. He faced the specters of the mind and laid them, and thus at length came to find a stronger faith his own, and power was with him in the night that also made the light and dwells not in the light alone.
Wow.
And I was struck by that. It was the reason why I committed it to memory, but of, walking into grief and the kinds of questions. Grief takes us to the bone with faith questions sometimes. But to have, Bill, as you're saying, to have the trust and the faith to say, I can go there and God will not drop me if I go there. God will still be with me.
Peggy, there is a practice called the welcoming prayer. Have you heard of this? When during the day, when grief hits you, rage, anger, this is a practice that also goes along with centering prayer during the daytime as a component of owning what happens on the moment. And you may be by yourself and you say, welcome grief, welcome anger, to acknowledge right away what's in front of you at the present moment and not suddenly just say, well, that's just a quick, I'm in rage, but I can't really do anything. I think when you say welcome rage, welcome anger, welcome grief, and then when you say that, you don't try to dodge it. And then you begin to sense, where is God in the midst of this? Help me as I'm going through this. And when you're in a rush, you may not be able to do much at that point. But it's a it's not a solution, but it is a naming of what's happening at the moment. And if we can do that, it's learning to let be so God can be with you. And I like what Catherine, you're saying, where's God's presence with us? It's right in the middle of us saying, welcome grief. And you may say something else about it. God, I'm in grief, or whatever you want to say. But it's kind of dealing with the present moment when we're alone. It may not be with someone coming in to see us. It may not be someone else, but it's our own acknowledgement at the moment. What is very powerful, and it may be waking up from a dream in the morning and you feel that grief or whatever it happens. Any practice that you use on the present, my question is, on the present moment when something hits you and you're by yourself, nobody else is around to sit and listen to you for the moment, and it's during the daytime, and it hits you, as you were saying, it comes in waves, or it comes when you're not expecting it.
Well, first of all, that's a beautiful practice. I love that. Welcoming. I'm a big journaler. So if I'm in a spot in my day where I have the luxury of pulling out and just writing, and one of the journaling techniques I use and I recommend to other folks is writing the unsent letter that you can write to the person or whatever it is that you've lost, or whoever it is you've lost, and just write where you are in that moment, whether you are missing them. I'm so sorry you are not here to experience this. Could be that you're angry with them, whatever you're feeling, and just write it to them in a form of a letter. And I will do that. Sometimes it's just about breathing it in, which I think is another form of welcome, of acknowledging. Tears came to my eyes. That's grief, and that's okay. It's okay. I just had a little moment there. Grief can catch us so off guard.
I love that practice of the welcoming prayer and journaling to welcome the feeling of the moment. I think for me, what I need to be reminded of is that because I'm feeling pain and grief, kind of like Grace experienced her pastor telling her differently, my pain and grief doesn't put me outside the circle of God's love all of a sudden, that I haven't been somehow damaged or broken beyond being lovable, and that I can just be lovable exactly how I'm feeling, even if that's really raw. So I love that practice of kind of an unconditional welcome of how we are, and the assurance that God welcomes it and welcomes us in that feeling.
I use the example that grief sometimes feels like, and loss sometimes feels like you've been parachuted into a foreign country where you don't know the language and you don't know the customs. And you have to find a way to make a life. And when I'm working with grieving folks, I swear at least half of the counseling time is me saying, this is normal. This is normal. Again, we don't have great pictures. I hope you know the scene in the cemetery from Steel Magnolias, where they've just come from the funeral of Sally Field's daughter, Malin's daughter, and she just explodes in the cemetery. And she goes to anger, and my daughter's not here and she can't do this, and this is not right. And she's the point of saying, I just want to hit somebody. And they pull her and said, hit Weezer. But it's such a perfect thing, because Malin goes through in like a minute, she goes through all of these different feelings that are very natural and normal parts of grief.
Peggy, did you have a book that you wanted to close with?
Yes. This is a children's book. I'm not going to show you all the pictures, but I'm going to show you a couple of them. It's called The Rabbit Listened, and by Corey Dorfeld. And I was very touched. A client of mine gave it to me. One day, Taylor decided to build something new. Taylor's got blocks. Something new, something special, something amazing. Taylor was so proud. But then, out of nowhere, things came crashing down. The chicken was the first to notice. Cluck, cluck, cluck. What a shame. I'm so sorry this happened. Let's talk about it. But Taylor didn't feel like talking, so the chicken left. Next came the bear. Grrr, roar, how horrible. I bet you feel so angry. Let's shout about it. I'm scaring my cat. Grrr, roar, grrr. But Taylor didn't feel like shouting, so the bear left. The elephant knew just what to do. Ta-da, I can fix this. We just need to remember exactly the way things were. But Taylor didn't feel like remembering, so the elephant also left. One by one they came. The hyena, hee, let's laugh about it. The ostrich, gulp, let's hide and pretend nothing happened. The kangaroo, tisk, tisk, what a mess. Let's throw it all away. And the snake, shh, let's knock down someone else's mess. But Taylor didn't feel like doing anything with anybody. So eventually they all left until Taylor was alone. In the quiet, Taylor didn't even notice the rabbit, but it moved closer and closer until Taylor could feel its warm body. Together they sat in silence until Taylor said, "Please stay with me." The rabbit listened. The rabbit listened as Taylor talked. The rabbit listened as Taylor shouted. The rabbit listened as Taylor remembered and laughed. The rabbit listened to Taylor's plans to hide, to throw everything away, to ruin things for someone else. Through it all, the rabbit never left. And when the time was right, the rabbit listened to Taylor's plan to build again. I can't wait, Taylor said. It's going to be amazing. The end.
Beautiful.
So may we all be rabbits.
Wow, that was beautiful.
It's a wonderful little book.
Anyone have any reactions to the book that you'd like to share?
Oh, I'm going out and buying that book. I don't know how many copies I'll buy, but I did love the book.
It's right. Yeah, one of the ways that we shame ourselves with grief is by telling ourselves what we should be feeling. And someone posted an article on Medium, I think, about, I saw it on Facebook, about how when both of your parents are gone, things are never, ever the same and life is never quite right again. And it just went on and on. And I thought, yeah, I miss my folks.
Some days miss them a lot. But not everybody had good parents. For some people, when their parents are gone, it is a day of rejoicing because they had toxic or abusive or parents who struggled with addiction. So we make these assumptions about how we should feel. You know, if you've been a caregiver for a very long time, you may feel just relief because you've already done all of the grieving. Or if your loved one had dementia, you know, you lose them by inches.
Mhm.
So by the time they actually die, they've been gone a long time. So one of the things I've learned is when somebody tells me they've had a loved one die, I don't make an assumption about what that means to them. I don't say, oh, that must be awful, whatever, if I don't know the relationship. It's like, how are you doing with that? How are you? Because people feel all kinds of shame when they don't have like the approved reactions.
Got to create that space and let it be expansive and generous and as wide as we can get it for ourselves and others. Well, with much gratitude, Peggy, we say thank you for sharing all of this with us and just taking the time to engage this conversation. This program is just full of wisdom. And I can't wait to share it with the whole congregation. Thank you so much.
Thank you. It's first of all, it's great to see all of you. And, thank you for giving me a chance. Obviously, it's work that means a lot to me. So thank you for giving me a chance to reflect on it a bit.
Absolutely. Well, I'll say good night and go in peace. And we will gather again next week. We will, our guest speakers will be Dean Clifford and Roy and Rebecca Clifford, reflecting on guidance and discernment, how we might seek and follow and every once in a while ignore God's guidance as we move along through our journey. So covenant, presence, guidance, it'll all be woven together. I appreciate y'all being a part of this series. Good night.
Good night.
Thank you, Peggy.
You're
Thank you,
welcome.
Peggy.
Peggy.